Why are there people who study for hours and still don't remember anything, while others seem to learn effortlessly? Is it really a problem of intelligence, or is there something much deeper that no one has explained to you? Why is it that the more you try, the more frustration you feel? And there is an even more disturbing detail. Perhaps the error is not in your memory, but in the way your brain was trained from the beginning. Stay, because understanding this changes everything. For years, we have been told the same idea. If we don't learn something, it's because we aren't trying hard enough. From school to adulthood, the message is clear and constant. You have to study hours, repeat more times, concentrate harder. And when that doesn't work, the conclusion seems inevitable. The problem is us. But this explanation, although convenient, is deeply incomplete. The real problem doesn't start when you try to learn something new today. It starts much earlier in the way you were taught to learn from the beginning. For decades, the educational system has prioritized the accumulation of information over real understanding, memorizing dates, definitions, formulas, without questioning how the brain processes that information. At first, it seems to work, but over time, the effect becomes the opposite. As we grow, the brain stops responding the same way to repetitive stimuli. It's no longer enough to reread a text or listen to an explanation several times. However, we continue to use exactly the same strategies we learned when we were children. And here the central contradiction arises. We expect different results using methods designed for another stage of life. This generates a constant feeling of blockage. You sit in front of a book, a course, or a video, and you feel that you understand in the moment, but the next day everything has vanished. It's not a lack of interest, nor of capacity. It's a disconnect between how you try to learn and how your mind actually processes information now. The original content points out something key. We aren't failing because we learn worse, but because no one taught us that learning also evolves. The adult brain doesn't work like a child's, but we continue treating it as if it did. And while we don't understand this fundamental difference, every new attempt to learn will feel like an unnecessary struggle. This is where the real change in perspective begins, and also the start of the internal conflict that so many experience without knowing why. When a method doesn't work, most people don't question the method. They question themselves. This is one of the most silent damages left by the traditional learning system. Gradually, a dangerous belief sets in. I'm not good at this. My memory is bad. I'm no longer at the age to learn. These ideas don't appear out of nowhere. They are born from repeating ineffective strategies over and over without visible results. The original content insists that this loss of confidence is not accidental. It is the direct consequence of associating learning with constant effort and frustration. When you study a lot and remember little, the brain interprets the experience as a failure, and every new attempt reinforces the same feeling. Over time, learning stops being curiosity and becomes anxiety. Something important happens here. The brain starts to protect itself. Faced with the expectation of failing again, it reduces attention, procrastinates, gets distracted. Not because you are lazy, but because your mind has learned that this context brings discomfort. Thus, a vicious circle is formed that is difficult to break. The harder you try, the worse you feel. The worse you feel, the less you retain. The most serious thing is that this belief becomes invisible. You no longer question it. You simply accept that there are things that aren't for you. Languages, technology, new studies, even personal projects. The problem was never the complexity of the content, but the emotional relationship that was created around learning. The competitor's text underlines a key point. When someone learns with the right method, confidence returns almost immediately. Not because the content is easier, but because the brain stops feeling attacked. It understands that it isn't being forced, but guided. Until this false belief is broken, any new technique will seem useless. That's why, before talking about how to learn better, it is necessary to understand why so many give up even before starting. One of the most common errors when studying is believing that repeating information many times guarantees it will stay in memory. Rereading a text, highlighting it, listening to it over and over seems logical. It gives a sense of progress. However, the original content explains that this sensation is deceptive. Familiarity is not understanding, and momentary understanding is not lasting memory. When you repeat without an active process, the brain enters an automatic mode. It recognizes words, phrases, even anticipates what comes next. That produces an illusion of mastery. But in reality, the information is not being integrated. It's just passing through the surface of the mind. That's why when the context changes or a little time passes, everything disappears. The brain learns when it is forced to reconstruct information, not when it simply recognizes it. This point is key and is often overlooked. Repeating without real cognitive effort does not strengthen neural connections. On the contrary, it weakens them because the brain stops paying attention to something it already believes it knows. The problem is aggravated when we use exhaustion as an indicator of good study. Many people think, if I finish exhausted, I did a good job. But mental exhaustion doesn't always mean learning. Often it only indicates saturation. The original text points out that learning better is not learning more time, but learning in a different way. Here another important contradiction appears. The longer and heavier the study sessions, the less real retention they produce. The brain needs pauses, changes of focus, and moments of recovery to consolidate information. Without them, everything mixes and is lost. This misunderstanding explains why so many people feel that they study without moving forward. It's not a lack of discipline, it's an inefficient use of mental energy. Until this difference is understood, continuing to repeat will be like filling a leaking container. And this is only one part of the problem. It remains to understand what the brain really needs to remember in the long term. The original content makes it clear that memory doesn't work like an archive, where you store information and retrieve it when you want. It functions more like a living network that strengthens or weakens depending on how it's used. For something to be remembered in the long term, the brain needs meaning, connection, and context. Without these elements, the information simply has no reason to stay. One of the most important points is that the brain prioritizes what it considers useful or relevant for survival. Not in a literal sense, but emotionally and practically. If a piece of data doesn't connect with something you already know, with an experience, a question, or a real problem, the brain classifies it as expendable. That's why many remember conversations, stories, or past mistakes, but forget entire pages of a book studied yesterday. Effective learning occurs when new information is linked to previous knowledge. It's not about adding more content, but about building bridges. The competitor's text insists that when memorization is forced without these connections, the brain resists. Not out of rebellion, but for efficiency. Emotion also comes into play. You don't need an extreme emotion, but a minimum internal impact. Curiosity, surprise, even a slight intellectual discomfort. When something makes you ask yourself why, the brain activates in a different way. In contrast, flat and disconnected information evaporates quickly. Another essential element is time. Not continuous study time, but distributed time. The brain needs spaces to reorganize information, reinforce it, and consolidate it. Sleeping, resting, and changing activities are not interruptions of learning. They are part of the process. The problem is that most were never taught to respect these needs. We were taught to force, not to cooperate with the mind. And while we continue to ignore how the brain really works, we will continue blaming ourselves for failures that don't belong to us. Understanding this opens the door to a profound change, but there is still a key piece missing that connects all of the above. Another central point of the original content is that the brain doesn't learn well in chaos. When information arrives disordered, without a clear common thread, the mind puts more effort into orienting itself than into understanding. Many people study by accumulating data, concepts, and examples without a previous structure, expecting everything to fit together on its own. That almost never happens. The brain needs to know where it is and where it is going. When there is no clear structure, every idea is perceived as isolated. This generates confusion and a constant feeling of being lost. It's not that the content is difficult, it's that there is no mental map that allows it to be organized. Without that map, remembering becomes extremely complicated. The competitor's text explains that a good structure reduces cognitive load. Instead of spending energy trying to understand how ideas relate, the brain can concentrate on the meaning. That's why, when someone understands the general logic of a topic, the details start to fit in with more ease. They aren't memorized, they are placed in their spot. A frequent error is starting directly with technical details without understanding the complete picture. This creates the sensation that everything is important and nothing stands out. The brain doesn't know what to prioritize, so it ends up discarding everything. Learning like this is like trying to put together a puzzle without seeing the final image. Structure doesn't mean rigidity. It means progressive order. Knowing what comes first, what depends on what, and why each part exists. When learning follows a logical sequence, the mind cooperates. When it doesn't, it defends itself. This point explains why many people understand an explanation when they hear it, but cannot repeat it later. The information went in, but it didn't find a stable place to stay. Without structure, there is no anchor. Until now, we have seen false beliefs, ineffective methods, useless repetitions, and lack of connection. Everything points to a clear conclusion, but it remains to understand how to join all these pieces into a single way of learning. After understanding how the brain processes information, the original content reaches a key point. Learning well doesn't depend on a single trick, but on the right combination of several simple principles. The problem is that most try to apply only one and expect immediate results. When they don't see them, they give up or blame themselves. The first step is to change the focus. Instead of asking yourself how much time you study, the right question is what your brain is doing during that time. If it's only recognizing information, it's not learning. If it's forced to think, relate, explain, and question, then it is building memory. Here is where the importance of active learning comes in. The competitor's content insists that the brain remembers better when it participates. It's not enough to listen or read. It needs to interact with the information, reformulate it in your own words, and face small difficulties. That slight discomfort is not a sign of failure. It is a sign of progress. Another essential element is intelligent review. It's not about reviewing everything from scratch, but returning to the information at strategic moments. This reminds the brain that this content remains relevant. Each review strengthens the connections, as long as it involves real effort and not simple recognition. Consistency also plays a fundamental role. Studying in an irregular and chaotic way confuses the mind. In contrast, shorter but constant sessions create a rhythm that the brain learns to anticipate. Over time, this reduces resistance and increases concentration. Finally, the content underlines something that is usually ignored. Learning is not accumulating, it's simplifying. When you can explain an idea in a clear and simple way, it's a sign that you truly understood it. If you can't, it's not yet integrated. All of the above demonstrates that learning well is not a matter of talent or age. It is a matter of method. And when the method changes, the results do too. Only one last part remains to close this whole process and understand why this change is so powerful in the long term. The last part of the original content doesn't talk about new techniques, but about a deep shift in mindset. All of the above leads to a central idea. The problem was never your capacity to learn, but the way you were taught to do it. For years, many people assumed that forgetting meant being incapable, when in reality it was a direct consequence of wrong methods. When you understand how the brain works, the guilt disappears. You stop seeing yourself as someone bad at studying and start seeing learning as a trainable process. The competitor's text emphasizes that this change is liberating because it breaks a belief that limits millions of people since childhood. Learning stops being a constant struggle and becomes a dialogue with your mind. You no longer force, you collaborate. You start to notice that you remember more with less effort, not because you study less seriously, but because you study with intention. Each session has a clear purpose, each pause makes sense, each mistake becomes useful information. Another key point of the closing is the long term. It's not just about passing an exam or finishing a course. It's about building a way of learning that stays with you all your life. When you know how to absorb information, adapt to new contexts, and connect ideas, any future knowledge becomes more accessible. The original content also leaves a silent warning. If you continue studying as usual, you will get the same results as always. But if you change the method, even small adjustments can generate a huge impact. It's not a radical change from one day to the next, but a constant evolution. In the end, learning well is not a privilege of a few. It is a skill that anyone can develop when they understand the real rules of the game. And once you understand them, there is no turning back. Because at that moment, studying stops being a burden and becomes a tool of personal power.